Ike for president, Ike for president, Ike for president, Ike for president. You like Ike, I like Ike. Everybody likes Ike for president. Hang out the banner, beat the drum. We'll take Ike to Washington.
Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, he was a popular candidate. When he became president, his immediate concerns were the ending of the Korean War, with the deal mainly negotiated by Truman already. In the campaign, he pledged to roll back communism, and soon after taking office, Stalin died, changing up diplomacy with a new Soviet leader. So his pledge to roll back communism, it was very popular and went beyond just simply containing it as Truman set out to do. Additionally, the US still had a nuclear advantage, especially from the location of bases, with no Soviet bases really close to the US. Eisenhower planned to use a threat of mass nuclear retaliation to deter Soviet aggression, and in the process save money on the army, which at that point had its military budget increased 4 times in the last years of the Truman administration due to the Korean War and trying to shore up defences in Europe. The new Soviet leader, Nikolai Khrushchev. After Stalin's death, there was a power struggle and Khrushchev came out on top. His approach was a wave of de-Stalinization, denouncing Stalin's cult of personality and brutalism in a secret speech to the party congress. That didn't really stay secret for long. He changed the way international diplomacy happened through his different approach. He was more willing to negotiate than Stalin was, less hardline. So the end to the Korean War, it was a conflict that had become stagnant. Eisenhower signed the ceasefire agreement, which brought an end to the war, but it didn't roll back communism. So even in just his first few months as president, he's already failing that campaign pledge, failing to roll back communism. And despite that, people were still happy that the troops were coming home. In Vietnam, the French, who had been fighting the communist guerrillas since the end of the war, withdrew from the colony as the costs just became too high and the USA was no longer able to support them enough. The US jointly organised the creation of the North and South of Vietnam, providing economic support to the South. This peace would not last very long, and it would really come to dominate US foreign policy in the next 20 years. So the domino theory, it was almost an attachment onto the Truman Doctrine, which said that if Vietnam was allowed to fall, that communism would just spread like wildfire through the rest of Asia, because there'd not really be anything to stop it. In 1955, you had the Warsaw Pact founding, and it was in response to West Germany joining NATO, which was an attempt to boost the troop numbers really against the USSR. Later that year, you also had the founding of SEATO, Eisenhower's push for defence agreements against communism. This one was in Southeast Asia and acted very much like NATO. Domestically, you also had the Federal Aid Highway Act. It was not only important for transporting military equipment, but it also proved a massive economic boom to the country. Going back to Europe, you had the Eastern European uprisings, stemming from a dissatisfaction with bad conditions and a Stalinist-style Hungarian leader. Large protests turned into a revolution against communism, the revolutionaries demanding free elections and the removal of Soviet troops. At the same time, workers in East Berlin protested over the high work quotas and low pay that came about thanks to their own 5-year plan. Both ended up being crushed by the army with tanks. Later that year, you had the Suez Crisis. The Suez Crisis was the result of America withdrawing its aid to Egypt. Egypt at the time was wanting to construct a new dam, but without this aid, Egypt nationalised the Suez Canal, hoping to collect tariffs from the lucrative shipping connection between Europe and Asia. They ended up also receiving Soviet financial support and arms. In response to all this, Israel, France and Britain mounted a coalition attack on Egypt to try to regain control of the dam. Militarily, it was a big victory, since the Egyptian army really was no match to these powers. However, it really did have huge diplomatic consequences. At the time, the US was trying to gain influence in the Middle East and prevent the USSR from gaining a foothold and therefore accessing their oil reserves. The Eisenhower Doctrine was therefore a pledge that any Middle Eastern country could request military aid or economic aid in response to outside aggression. And as you can imagine, these American allies attacking a Middle Eastern country like this, America couldn't really abide by it. So in line with Eisenhower's doctrine, the US, with no prior notification of their intent for this invasion, heavily disapproved. Under the threat of harsh economic sanctions that would have crippled the rebuilding European countries as well as Israel, the forces withdrew in a major humiliation for the old colonial powers. Domestically, the US Civil Rights Act 1957 was a major piece of legislation, the first civil rights legislation in 80 years. And it did make some steps forwards, such as the founding of a Civil Rights Commission, but it did also have major shortfalls due to being restricted in Congress. It really didn't result in any major African American voter participation boost, and it was greatly hampered by the continuing Southern voter suppression. 1957 saw the launch of Sputnik 1, the first Soviet satellite, and it shook the American public. It showed how far Soviet space technology was ahead, and Eisenhower took the blame for the low military budget providing little for new innovation. The next year, NASA was created to try to catch America up with some extra funds. So 1915 up to 1959, all communist nations acted unified, and this of course gave them great strength. But due to differences between the Soviet and Chinese interpretations of socialism, they split off in 1960. I'd like to cram in a side note here as well, that if you are interested in the recovery of these countries post-war, German recovery, Japanese, all that would be covered in higher education. It's at this time in Eisenhower's later years of his presidency, even after surviving a heart attack, he undertakes a diplomatic campaign across 27 different countries, utilizing jet travel and television in a new form of personal diplomacy. He even hosted Khrushchev for a US visit later that year. The kitchen debates, not exactly monumental, but I'd say it's significant in the softening tensions between the two. It was a series of debates between capitalism and communism at the American exhibition in Moscow. And it was the first such meeting of officials since 1955 and was mainly brought about by Eisenhower's diplomatic push. By 1960, Operation Blue Desert Rat made France the fourth nuclear power, and as I said earlier, this trend of nuclear proliferation would not let up anytime soon. So in the backdrop of all this softening of diplomatic tensions, you have the U-2 spy plane incident. It really soured much of the progress that had been going on at the time and ended the planned three-nation talks. So these U-2 spy planes, they were spying at high altitude in USSR airspace, and when the plane was discovered, it was shot down by the Soviet Air Force. Eisenhower initially tried to deny its true mission, but eventually admitted for the past 3 years similar missions had been going on. And in 1960, you have the founding of the National Liberation Front of South Vietnam, better known as the Viet Cong. These would grow into a major threat for the next presidents. So, in case anyone zoned out there, we got the summary of Eisenhower. And overall, his use of a nuclear deterrent was an effective alternative to high military spending, and it freed up money for social welfare programs and NASA to compete with the Soviet Union. Eisenhower also strengthened collective defense agreements like SEATO and NATO, strengthening the protection against communism. He also made some steps forward with civil rights and would lay the groundwork for changes later on. However, he was not able to roll back communism as he pledged to. Vietnam and Korea were both split, and he did not liberate the people in the Eastern European uprising in 1956. But again, this might be a bit unfair considering if he had tried anything, it probably would have just resulted in nuclear war. He also did nothing to counter the Red Scare, At the time, McCarthy was operating freely and created so much paranoia, destroying many people's reputation and jobs. Eisenhower disagreed with it, but he didn't speak up.